Welcome back. The last video I showed you, I was tracing off all the bits, all the fly bits, and well, I'd drawn out the fly bits and the waistband lining, etc. And as I said, the next step was to cut everything out. So I just thought I'd show you the cut out final patterns. This is my front. I've drawn on my waistline, my hip or seat line, and my knee line. And there you go, that's all down to the hem. You can see I've done a long straight of grain, and I've marked on it the front trouser. Just write front trouser panel, 40 waist. I'm just going to put the date. Oh, I have already. Got the waist 40 inch, February 23rd, the date, when I've drafted it, and cut one pair, 2 in top cloth. You always put one pair because you want to make sure you cut a pair. If you want to cut check trousers, for example, you would probably lay them out separately, but usually you'd lay out your fabric so that it's double thickness, and then you would cut right sides together, and then you would cut out a pair at the same time. But it's just to remind you, just in case, and it just means that you need to cut 2 of them, and they've got to be a pair. I've also written, it's upside down, but I've also written no seam allowance. And then underneath, also what I've got on here are the side notches for my pockets. So I would probably just do a little arrow saying pocket opening, just so that I know. And I've also notched where the fly is going to go. I'm going to talk to you about that in a moment again, because I think it's too low. I'll get the fly piece and talk to you about that as well. I'll just show you quickly before I do that. Underneath we've got the back panel, and again I've drawn on my waistline, my seat line, the dart, my knee line. I've got a straight of grain, you can see down to the bottom of the trouser, and they're 40 waist trousers, February 23rd. Back trouser panel, cut one pair in top cloth, brackets 2, no seam allowance. Okay, so all the information that I need is on there. Obviously, if it was for somebody, I'd put their name on there. If it was for production, I'd put the production on, but it's not for this, for what I'm doing. So if I just get my front trouser back for the minute, maybe we just move the back panel out of the way. So let's just put it back over there. Oh, we will need the back actually, because I've also got these pieces. So let's start with the fly piece, and we'll just make that alteration. I drew this out, and then, oh, it's not in the right place anyway. Okay, I drew this out, and then looked at where that placement was, and I think it's too low. Basically, that notch is where the bottom of your fly piece will be open to, the bottom of the trouser front opening. I think it's too low, so I actually want to move it up by 1 inch. So I'm just going to mark that on my trouser, okay, and rub out my original notch line. Okay, good practice would also be to go back to the master pattern and mark that on again as well. Okay, the length of the fly piece is fine, because when you top stitch, you'll come below that line, so it's good to have that length there. I've put on there the 40-inch waist trousers, the year that, or the time that I've cut them, what it is, fly piece. Cut one pair in cloth, brackets 2, because we need a pair, and then cut 3 in lining. What I usually end up doing is cutting 2 pairs and cut 4, and then get rid of one of them. But what you actually need is 3 in lining. And I've also written on there that there's no seam allowance. So all your pattern pieces should have all the same information. Again, if this was for somebody, and if I was worried that if I was working in a studio with other pattern cutters, I'd put my name on it as well. So that's my fly piece. And then we have, come back to waistbands in a moment, and then we have the pocket bag, which will sit here. Just check that your notches are in the same place. I've written cut on fold. This is the straight of grain. Going back to my fly piece, straight of grain, and then the 40 waist trousers, February 23rd. Cut 1 pair, brackets 2 on the fold, or 2 pairs, brackets 4 if not on the fold, and there's no seam allowance. I usually cut 1 pair or 2 pocket bags on the fold, but it's up to you whether if you can't fit it on, then you have to put a seam there, then you have to cut 4. Okay, and then the last bit before we go on to waistbands, that's my facing. So as I said when I was drafting it, you can follow the shape of the side seam if you want to, but I want this bigger shape. And it's for 40 waist trousers when I've cut it, and they're what it is, pocket facing, and cut 2 pairs, brackets 4, and there's no seam allowance. And I've just realised that I haven't said what this is. So this is a pocket bag. Okay, right, and then the last thing I want to talk to you about is the waistband lining. So when I showed you earlier about drafting the waistband lining, I actually cut it off at the waistline. When I was tracing them out, I thought, no, that's not going to work. It's too narrow. So I've actually brought it down by 2 centimeters. And I've done the same on the back as well. So it's the waistband size, but it's just 2 centimeters longer. And then I've marked on there what it is, front waistband for what trousers when it was cut, that it's the waistband lining, and you cut 1 pair in lining, brackets 2, and that's the straight of grain which is on the diagonal. And then for the back, again, straight of grain is on the diagonal, what it's for, back waistband lining, cut 1 pair in lining, brackets 2, no seam allowance. Now if you wanted to cut your trousers with a separate waistband, what you would do is you would fold back or cut off this extra section like that. Make sure it's on the line. My paper's curling near the end of the roll. And then do the same on the back. Okay. And then you take your waistband lining and get rid of that 2 centimeters that I've just added on. And then put side seam to side seam. That's my back, that's my front. And then you could redraft it, basically trace it again and create 1 waistband. But what you'd also need to do is you need to create an extension piece, because you need well, it depends what you did with the fly, but I would think that you would want to extend this so that you've got an overlap, and then you would reduce the height of the fly by the waistband height as well. You can do it so that the waistband goes all the way to the top. There's no one way of making anything. When I've taught the students, they've got, well, which is the right way? There's no right way, because there's so many different ways. Everybody does things differently. So on my fly piece, if I actually marked where the waistline is, I could then trim that off as well if I was doing a separate waistband. and then you'd add an extension which would allow for that width, okay, to fill in that gap. And that would be for your button stand, okay. But these are going to be grown on waistband trousers, so I don't want to do that. So that is beginning to end how you draft using a tailor square, how you draft a pair of late 19th century trousers, and then cut them all the pieces out so that it is ready for laying on the cloth, adding seam allowance, and then cutting out. Just talking about seam allowance, so I'll go through it very quickly, and then maybe when I'm laying it on the cloth I'll come back to it. This thing called inlay, which is allowing for alteration of sizes. So it's traditional that on your front panel you would put, and this is going to vary because I work in inches a lot of the time, I would add on my front panel I would add 1/2 inch around all sides, apart from my hem, which I would add on 5 centimeters, 2 inches. So 1/2 inch everywhere else, and then 2 inches at the bottom. On my back panel, however, because just in case my customer went and put on some weight, we need to allow for that and add some inlay in. So on the top edge you would add 1/2 inch seam allowance, but on the side seam you would add 1 inch. On the inside leg you'd add 1 inch, so it could be let out. On the hem I would do whatever I've done on the front trouser, so that's 2 inches. And then on the back you would add 1/2 inch down at the crutch, but then you would come out, graduate it out so that you end up with you graduate it out so that you end up with 2 inches at the back, at the centre back at the top, which would mean that you could let it out at the waist here, okay. So it's just giving you that extra space, and you do all of that on the back panel. And obviously then if you've got 2 inch seam allowance here, then you will need your waistband lining to have 2 inch seam allowance, but it'll have 1/2 inch on the top, and then it'll have 1 inch on the side seam. Your front trouser waistband lining would have 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. Your pocket facing doesn't need seam allowance on these 3 edges, but it does here, so that would have 1/2 inch seam allowance. Your fly piece needs to have 1/2 inch on all 3 sides. And your pocket bag, this line, depending on if you don't cut it on the fold, then you need to add seam allowance of 1/2 inch. I wouldn't add anything there. You don't need anything here. You can add on 1/2 inch on your side seam, and it's up to you. You can add on 1/2 inch down here as well, but you don't need it necessarily. It just makes your pocket a bit deeper. So none on the top, because it will, once you stitch your waistband lining down, you will actually trap that in. And that's everything. Obviously that's inches. If you want to do it in centimeters, you might only put a centimeter seam allowance. Where I've used 1/2 inch, where I've used 2 inches, you'd use 5 centimeters. On the side seam, on the back panel, where I've said about the inlay, you'd add 2.5 centimeters, which is equal to 1 inch, and the same on the inside leg. I hope this is really has been of use to you, and I hope it's been interesting. If you've got any comments, add them in the comment section. If you've got any questions, then you can contact me directly. I will put some information in the chat, not in the chat, in the description, about how to get the pattern instructions. And hopefully we'll do another video which will show me laying it out on the fabric and cutting it out, and then making them as well. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you have, please subscribe, Please like the video as well, that would be great, and I will see you again soon. Thank you very much for your time. Have a good day.